welcome. Welcome to Sangha Storytime. A Taste of the Earth by Thich Nhat Hanh. Earth cakes and sky cakes. The new year had arrived. All the king's relatives and friends had been invited to the palace to watch him wrap earth cakes and sky cakes. King Hanh II was a just and good-hearted king. His joyful spirit attracted wholesome and talented people to help him run the country. Many people who had committed crimes repented and became fine citizens, thanks to his great mercy. He wrote laws and created new customs to enhance the lives of the people. It was thanks to King Hanh II that the people of Van Lang chewed aka, a custom that warmed the atmosphere at all social gatherings. For several years, people throughout the kingdom had imitated King Hanh in making earth and sky cakes to offer to the ancestors at New Year. It was said, however, that no one's cakes could compare to the king's, and people wondered if he had some special technique of wrapping them. When the king heard this, he smiled, and then he invited all the court for a New Year's Eve dinner, after which they could watch and help him make the cakes. Princess Tang Dang, the king's beloved daughter, greeted the guests as they arrived. She offered the adults a slice of aka and gave the children coconut candy and banana cake that she herself had made. The children, dressed in new clothes, flocked around her like excited small birds. As aka was chewed, happy conversation popped like popcorn. Then King Hanh entered the hall and everyone stood silently. He was dressed in a golden robe with a dragon embroidered across the chest, wearing a crown shaped like a blackbird. It was fashioned from feathers and jade, and his slippers were bright red. The king opened his arms wide and welcomed all his guests. Please be seated and continue your happy conversations. He walked throughout the hall to greet each person individually. Then he sat upon the throne in the corner of the hall, and his attendants served everyone a simple meal of sweet rice and peanuts. After the guests finished eating, the king's attendants set up a long table in the hall and placed the ingredients for earth and sky cakes, which were fresh banana leaves, sweet long-grained rice already soaked and rinsed, and yellow mung beans. Everyone knew that these were the necessary ingredients for New Year's cakes, but how the king made such beautiful cakes was still a mystery to all that were present. A fire was built that warmed the hall, and on it a huge kettle was placed in which to boil the earth cakes. The king left to chance and soon returned wearing simple cotton clothes. Everyone listened intently as he spoke. My friends, I've invited you here this evening to tell you a story. You all know how to make New Year's cakes to offer to our ancestors, many of you better cooks than I. And you make far more delicious cakes than I do too. But the most important ingredient, which I hope my story will show, is love. Then the king told them this story. Though Li was a son of King Hanh I, he did not live as luxuriously as other princes and princesses of the kingdom. His mother, one of the king's consorts, preferred a simple country life. To her, wealth was unnecessary. She asked for nothing from the king and taught her son to live simply in order to have the time to learn what was truly worthwhile in life. One day the king issued a decree that each prince was to prepare a special meal to offer at the ancestral altar on New Year's Day. He said that each offering should express deep respect and gratitude to the ancestors. Because Li lived in the country far from the palace, he learned of the decree much later than his brothers. What's more, his mother had recently died, and he had no one to counsel him about the palace etiquette. He thought about the king's decree. It was like a competition. The prince who bought the most precious and delicious dish would surely be commended, and perhaps even given a high post. Li had no money to buy exotic ingredients, nor did he possess great skill as a cook. He felt disturbed. He believed the kingdom flourished because of the virtue and knowledge people possessed, and not because they had the wealth to prepare exotic cuisine. He resolved not to enter the contest and took a long walk to try to forget about it. That night he went to bed without supper. His mother appeared to him in a dream. She smiled kindly and said, "My son, you have misunderstood the king. He does not demand wealth or fancy skill as a cook. He is looking only for a good heart, and I know you possess this." Li wanted to ask his mother what she meant, but she only smiled and pointed to the rice fields with one hand and to the sky with the other. When Li awoke, he thought about his dream. Yes, his mother was surely right. The king was looking for more than an exotic food. How could Li best express his gratitude and respect to the ancestors? And how could he show his desire to protect all that the ancestors had built? Could he do it without using rare and precious ingredients? He thought about his mother's clue, one hand pointing to the rice fields and one hand pointing to the blue sky. Of course, the square-shaped patties were an image of earth and the blue sky an image of heaven. Earth nourished the people, heaven watched over them. These were the most precious gifts bequeathed them by the goddess mother and dragon father. Li sat looking out over the rice fields all morning. At noon he had an idea. He walked back to his hut and soaked a pot of sweet rice after selecting the most perfect grains. He also soaked a pot of beans and then placed them on the fire to cook. He gathered fresh banana leaves in the forest. He planned to make some cakes that were square-shaped to represent Mother Earth and all the plants that flourished on her. He used sweet rice because it was the people's most basic and essential food, enjoyed by even the poorest families in the kingdom. He filled the cakes with bean paste and fragrant onions to represent other gifts from the earth. He shaped the cakes into perfect squares and wrapped them in fresh banana leaves bound by fine, thin strips of bamboo. He boiled them in a large kettle until the rice was cooked. While the earth cakes were boiling, he steamed another pot of sweet rice, which he then pounded into a smooth paste. He shaped the paste into spheres to represent the sky and placed them on fresh green leaves. Both kinds of cakes were made without any waste, using only the simple ingredients that were available to all people, rich or poor. When the earth cakes were done, he opened one up The banana leaves had left a faint imprint of green. When he cut the cake open, up rose a familiar and delicious smell. He knew that his square cakes were a worthy symbol of Mother Earth, and his round cakes a worthy symbol of heaven. He selected the 10 best of both kinds and put them aside before retiring for the night. That night, his mother visited him again in a dream. She did not speak, but a smile told Lee how pleased she was with the cakes. In the morning, he put on a clean robe and sandals and carried the cakes in 2 baskets balanced on a shoulder yoke. By the time he reached the palace, the other princes had already placed their exotic and fancy dishes on the ancestral altar. Lee suddenly felt ashamed at how humble his offering was. He feared his brothers would laugh at him. Nonetheless, he placed his cakes on the altar next to the other offerings. The king commenced the New Year's ceremonies. After the ancestral offerings had been made, each prince carried his dish down to the king to examine and taste. The king stood for a long moment in front of each offering and asked each prince in detail about its preparations. Some dishes were made with delicate ingredients which could only be found in the deepest reaches of the forests or upon the highest mountains. Others were cooked from rare ingredients fished from the hearts of rivers or the depths of the sea. The king paused when he reached the earth and sky cakes. He asked Lee how he had made them and whether the shapes had any meaning. He gazed at Lee for a long, quiet moment. Lee felt uneasy standing there among his richly clad brothers. The king asked to taste the 2 cakes and then complimented Lee on their good flavour. He moved on to carefully examine all the other dishes. A month later, Lee was summoned to the palace. The king told him that because he possessed the heart, piety, and talent to protect the kingdom and honour the ancestors, the king intended to pass the throne on to him. Lee was overcome with surprise and asked the king how he had arrived at such a decision. The king told him that the earth and sky cakes had been enough to let him know that Lee would be a worthy king. That evening the king announced his decision to the people. Not one of the other princes expressed any resentment or jealousy. And so Lee, who had been raised in the simple countryside, became King Hanh II. He taught the people how to make earth and sky cakes, telling them that it was not skill in cooking that mattered, but a heart filled with love and with gratitude. To this day, Vietnamese families offer such cakes on their ancestral altars at New Year, their hearts filled with love for their homeland.